Good afternoon. I would like to thank the GW Law community for joining us. My name is Alexa Kiernan, and I am Associate Director of GW Law Alumni Relations. During this ever-changing COVID-19 pandemic, GW Law thought it would be helpful to our community to provide an opportunity to hear the reflections of members of our faculty about how they have adapted their teaching. In addition, we will discuss the effects of the pandemic on their particular fields of research and practice. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Dean Jessica Tillipman. She is the Assistant Dean for Field Placement and Professorial Lecturer in Law at the George Washington University Law School. In addition to managing the law school's externship program, she teaches an anti-corruption and compliance course that focuses on anti-corruption, ethics, and compliance issues. She also regularly advises foreign governments and companies on anti-corruption and compliance issues. Prior to joining GW Law, Dean Tillipman was an associate in Jenner & Block's Washington, D.C. office, where she was a member of the firm's government contracts and white-collar criminal defense and counseling practice groups. She joined Jenner & Block after serving as a law clerk to the Honorable Lawrence S. Margulis of the U.S. Court of Federal Claims. Dean Tillipman is a senior editor of the FCPA blog, a leading Foreign Corrupt Practices Act resource on the internet, and her legal commentary has been featured in numerous domestic and international media outlets. She is also the co-chair of the American Bar Association, section of International Law Anti-Corruption Committee. Dean Tillipman graduated from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and obtained her JD with honors from the George Washington University Law School. Dean Tillipman, thank you for joining us today. We are thrilled to have you as our first guest speaker in this COVID-19 legal briefing webinar series with GW Law faculty.
Thank you for having me. It's really great to be here with you and everyone who may be listening today.
Let's start off with our first question, Dean Tillipman. You're an experienced online educator. Would you share some of your favorite moments from the distance education experience? What do you do to keep your students engaged while online?
Well, it's a great question. And let me just say at the outset that my experience overall teaching classes online has been drastically different than the experience that many of my colleagues encountered this semester as we transitioned our on-campus classroom to the online format. So I teach as part of the government procurement community. As part of the government procurement program here at the law school. I've been teaching for the past decade an anti-corruption and compliance course on campus. When the government procurement law program at the law school started to create online courses several years ago, I was asked to basically convert my on-campus anti-corruption and compliance course to a separate semester of online learning, courses that would then be available to LLM students and then students seeking their master's in law. So it was limited to these students, typically professionals that would work during the day, but wanted to obtain some additional expertise in online education, but were located outside the DC metro area and needed access to our courses. I have to admit myself, I was shocked at the outset learning about what online education entailed. I think my experience, like many others, was to see these things called MOOCs online, maybe through things like the Khan Academy. I had very little experience with online education. But really, I was so impressed at the outset. It was a 6 to 9 month process to create an online course version of my normal anti-corruption and compliance course. The Maine University has an incredible program with professional videographers that help you to design a learning platform that is pedagogically sound, engaging, all these things that I didn't expect to see. And so we spent a lot of time really thinking about the most effective course to our students and how to engage them, even though they would be outside the DC metro area or even just outside of our classroom. And so overall, that's been an incredible. Now, radically different than what we experienced this spring. We effectively had 1 week to convert our on-campus classes into an online platform. And even I was teaching my on-campus version this spring. It wasn't my fall online version. So I still didn't have the same mechanisms and platforms available to me in this online transition. But I really felt for colleagues, not just at GW Law School, but in law schools and educational institutions, all around the world, whether it be kindergarten or even in DC pre-K, all the way up through graduate programs. You had many educators really learning for the first time what it meant to teach online. And I think the transition was not what we would see in some of these more well thought out online programs. It was effectively triage for everyone. And in fact, some of you listening today may be parents and have experienced this in your own homes, watching your own children do this. Many instructors that aren't familiar with it, it was really just, like I said, triage, trying to get people to convert their on-campus classes to an online format. And as you can imagine, it's challenging. A, because some of the instructors aren't familiar with the technology, but B, because there's some things that are very difficult to translate. Imagine our trial advocacy classes being translated. How do you conduct a trial online? How do you conduct a negotiation or mediation online? And so we really had to sit down, and I worked really closely with Associate Dean Skank to work really closely with the adjunct professors who had to teach some of these experiential courses on how to really convert it to a manner that was engaging, that tried to capture the essence and the educational aspects of these exercises in an online platform. And I would say, I think it worked pretty well. There's a lot of amazing technology out there, a lot of tools out there to do these sorts of things. But I thought it was great. My transition went well. I'm comfortable in an online format, so it was pretty easy. The students are usually technologically, I think they found it, engaging. I think there's a lot going on in a pandemic that is distracting for obvious reasons. So I think the students had a lot on their plate dealing with it, dealing just with the pandemic as opposed to the online transition. I think they were quite patient with us. I think they understood that this was the first time for many professors to be doing this. I think they were patient. And, with my class, I had many guest speakers. I was able to integrate them seamlessly. I was able to do live exercises. Sometimes I had multiple simultaneous online sessions going at once so that I could have students doing different presentations and different experiential aspects of my course. So it's worked quite well. I do think, though, what we're seeing now is the law school really pivoting from, a triage mode, like many other schools around of the spring semester, to really actively thinking about this summer and how we're going to learn these classes effectively online and how to make the best use of technology as we move forward in this platform this summer.
Can you please address the pandemic's effects and significant questions being raised in your principal practice areas of government procurement and criminal law?
So my particular practice area is the intersection of anti-corruption and government procurement, which unfortunately often tend to go hand in hand. And anytime a government has to procure goods and services very quickly or respond to an emergency, the procurement system becomes quite vulnerable to fraud and corruption. Many times goods and services need to be acquired in a manner that is less transparent. And when there's a decrease in transparency, that can lead to abuses of the system. Often oversight mechanisms, we have many strong oversight mechanisms built into our system that are there to prevent or deter or mitigate fraud and corruption. Oftentimes they're overlooked or bypassed in favor of expediency. So that can be problematic. There's often a willingness, because contracting officials just need to get the job done, particularly in a pandemic where, personal protective equipment or PPE is so critically important and in demand, and there's a global supply chain shortage, that they are willing to overlook lots of things. They just need to, the goods and services to the people who need them immediately. So they're often willing to overlook problems, whether it be, the experience or past performance of a particular vendor, in favor of just making sure they can get those goods in hand. We're seeing, particularly when there's a lot of money being spent, a lot of new and sometimes even unqualified vendors entering the marketplace. When anytime you enter a procurement space with the government, there's a lot of rules and regulations. So we're seeing that be a potential risk. The federal response has been, however you rate it, disjointed at best. Some would say disorganized, some would say problematic. And when you see that clashing with what's happening at the state level, that can create a lot of problems with related to fraud and corruption, or that individuals and companies can try to exploit. And of course, we have new legislation that is overlaying everything through the stimulus, which can be confusing as we try to interpret our way through it. Often, when times when legislation is drafted quickly, it's been drafted poorly, and that leaves lots of room for interpretation and confusion as to how it should be implemented. And as I mentioned before, because of the global supply chain issues, it's really, we see lots of incidents of fraud where the people can be submitting goods that are non-compliant, that don't work. There's lowered standards, untested vendors, and in some instances, even bribery to get around some of the government regulations, or in certain instances, because our government as well as other governments have started to restrict the export of certain goods, we could potentially even see the bribery of government officials to try to release some of those goods. And I say this in the sense that the United States is a country that has strong existing anti-corruption mechanisms. We have a free press, very active watchdog groups in civil society. We have very strong laws and prosecutions. Now imagine what it's going to be like here, where we know this is going to be a problem. Imagine the countries that have limited transparency, high levels of corruption, even pre-pandemic, poor education, no free press, and weak law enforcement or weak laws. So we can really see that this is going to be a breeding ground for fraud and corruption globally.
What types of legal concerns regarding fraud and corruption do you foresee resulting from the over $1 trillion in government spending and assistance in response to the COVID-19 pandemic? Are they different from those you've seen recently?
So anytime you have an enormous stimulus, we saw this after 2008, we saw this in response to Afghanistan and Iraq, you're going to have additional oversight mechanisms put in place. It's just necessary because the government's going to be spending over $2 trillion on this. There's going to be more stimulus packages coming. So we know when there's this huge source of money being spent very quickly with less transparency and less oversight than we typically see, you need extra oversight mechanisms built into the legislation on top of what we have. So when I say less oversight, I simply mean, contracting officials won't be as able to provide kind of instantaneous oversight that they typically do because of the quick pace of everything. What we're really looking for is additional mechanisms, and that usually comes in the form of additional congressional oversight, additional mechanisms through inspectors general, which are within agencies designed to root out fraud, waste, and abuse. The CARES Act, which is the stimulus we're talking about, has three primary mechanisms: an Office of the Inspector General for Pandemic Recovery, a Congressional Oversight Commission, and also the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee. And all three of these mechanisms of oversight are in addition to what we already see in place within the government through the FBI and the Justice Department. All of these mechanisms are working hand in hand to try to provide that additional level of oversight because of the large amount of money being spent and to make up for some of the weaknesses inherent in emergency spending. I will say and mention one area of particular legal risk that you've asked about, which is an anti-fraud mechanism, and that's the United States False Claims Act. For those of you that are not familiar with the False Claims Act, this has been an incredibly powerful anti-fraud tool that's been around since the Civil War. It was created by Congress back in the 1800s in response to, contractors exploiting the needs of the Union Army, providing dying donkeys instead of horses, or, sugar or sand instead of sugar, things like that. So this statute's been around for an incredibly long time. It's worked incredibly well, but basically allows the government to go after fraud committed by, contractors, or really any type of individual that's receiving government money in a certain way, or submitting claims for government money. And what's so unique about this statute, it has this very powerful whistleblower mechanism, or the key TAM component of it, where it allows an individual, any individual really, to go to the government and allege an allegation that of a violation of the False Claims Act, allege an allegation of fraud, and the government has the chance to either intervene and take over that case, or that individual can go forth in the name of the government. And if that individual is successful in bringing this case, the most of the recovery then goes back to the government. So it's been an incredible tool to incentivize individuals to bring these cases in the name of the government, where recoveries have been quite large. And the penalties of this are staggering, between 11,000 and around 22,000 per false claim, and also treble damages. So it allows the government to recover huge amounts of money. It's incredibly dissuasive to individuals who don't want to face these types of fines and penalties. But the real incentive is for the whistleblowers to bring these cases, because if the government intervenes in a case, that individual can receive anywhere between 15 and 25% of the recovery. If the government doesn't intervene, that individual can receive 25 to 30% of the recovery. And if you can imagine, in 2019 alone, pre-pandemic, the government's recoveries under the False Claims Act were over 3 billion in recoveries in 2019. So 3 billion the government recovered in False Claims Act settlements and cases. It issued over $265 million in rewards. And that's because there was about 633 key TAM cases brought in 2019. So there's a lot of money at stake for whistleblowers to bring these cases. And that's a real incentive to potential whistleblowers who may be able to allege fraud associated with this stimulus. And in fact, we've even seen the plaintiffs' bar in the False Claims Act sphere calling on the government to create a task force to monitor and investigate these types of cases, and really trying to promote to the whistleblowers or would-be whistleblowers out there that this is a real area of risk and that they are listening if people have allegations to make.
Do you expect changes in traditional government contracting and procurement practices because of the new legislation and regulatory systems set up in response to the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so normally and presumptively, procurement systems are transparent because as taxpayers, we have a right to know where our money is being spent. But in emergencies, you often don't have the time or the resources to promote or publish these opportunities and awards. You don't have the time to do the sorts of things that you did before in order to get these goods and services so quickly. Because of that lack of transparency, you start to really see the increased risk of corruption and fraud taking place. So again, there's some legitimate reasons in the face of an emergency to reduce some of these oversight mechanisms. But again, it creates these problems, which is why we have some of those new oversight mechanisms built into the CARES Act. But I'll say, in response to what's happening, we're already hearing about allegations of fraud. There was an article that just came out the other day, reported by some investigative reporters, that this individual apparently responded to one of the president's tweets asking, or I guess the president tweeted, "Start making ventilators now." And somebody with 75 followers tweeted, "We can supply ICU ventilators, invasive and non-invasive. Have somebody call me urgent." And it was apparently some electrical engineer from Silicon Valley who has no experience in government procurement or medical devices. And New York was contacted by the White House coronavirus task force. And within 3 days, they paid him $69.1 million for 1,450 ventilators at a price of $47,656 per ventilator, which is triple the standard price for high-end models, and have received no ventilators to date. And part of the problem here is that, like many other states around the country, New York's government procurement rules typically require goods and services to be fulfilled before they make these payments. But those rules were suspended by Cuomo because of this urgent need for ventilators and 95 masks, gowns, and other PPE. So you had situations like this. According to this report, the health department in New York has cut 77 checks recently for over $1 million for medical supplies. And this is not the first instance. There was another instance of a company being paid $116 million to provide ventilators, and again, has not produced a single thing. So, New York's going to be quite busy. It has its own version of the False Claims Act. It'll be clawing back some of that money, or attempting to claw back some of that money. But this is being replicated over and over and over again at the state level, even at the federal level, and globally, as governments desperate for PPE are contracting with these unknown, untested individuals. They're really looking under every single rock to see, what might be there. They're, paying in advance. And in some instances, they're getting exactly what they needed. In some instances, they're getting defrauded. And that's why we have these tools in place, because I'll tell you right now, they're going to be going after some of these contractors. But the type of cases that result from, False Claims Act violations or other violations of law will be happening for years to come as, this is audited after the fact and the government discovers a lot of this fraud taking place. So we can expect a lot of litigation going forward.
Tell us about the field placement program and what are the opportunities and needs for potential placements that have arisen in this COVID-19 situation?
So similar to the transition to online education in the spring, it was triage mode this past spring. We, as a program, we require students to be working on site at the placement. We want them fully integrated because we view that, a student experience in an externship is not just the experience of learning the substantive law. It's the experience of working in the office environment, learning how the organization operates, and really interacting with colleagues. So really to move everything into remote placements was, in fact, triage. And we were just making sure we could get students successfully through the semester. And in many instances, it was great. We had some instances where students were saying, wow, this was really amazing. My placement really did integrate me fully into an online experience. There was others where we just really needed to make sure they got the assignments and their hours in to make sure that they complied with school requirements, complied with ABA requirements, and they got to the finish line because it was just a challenge across the board, not just for our students, but for placements. But now that we're planning for the summer where students will be interning online, we're not in triage mode. We're actively thinking about how can we make these externship experiences meaningful? How can they be educational? I'm working very closely with my counterparts at the various DC area law schools as we work on guidance and policies for the summer to ensure the integrity of this experience. So it's really been a bit of a sea change in our program, at least for this coming summer, where we're, trying to make sure that it's not just kind of remote directed email research from a placement. We want to make sure that they're meeting regularly through video conference with their supervisors, that they're participating in webinars or participating in team meetings, all of these things that they can try to integrate them into the office environment remotely, making them feel a part of the experience, trying to work with them to network over the summer, even if it's remotely, so that they can recreate it as much as possible and that we don't lose things in translation this summer.
In the post-COVID-19 world, could there be potential new externship opportunities that might result in growth and development in field placements?
Perhaps. I mean, certainly everyone's going to be trying to adapt to the new normal, whatever that is. On one hand, we may see some contraction in placements, typically in the national security area, if depending on what happens, if things remain that shut down, it's very difficult to do a national security type placement remotely because you can't get access to the documents, data, or the work that you need to do your job. But I actually think that there's a real opportunity here, and I think we're going to see some expansion. Whenever there's a downturn in the economy, externship opportunities increase exponentially, and that's because placements that typically couldn't, that were typically paying, turn to law schools and say, how can we be part of your educational externship program, which requires that externships be unpaid? What can we do to raise the bar in our own organization to be part of an educational externship program because we can no longer afford to pay students? So even though that's, not great news for the students who are expecting payment, the somewhat of a silver lining is that we're raising the bar in many new organizations that try to join our program. We did see that rise in 2008, government placements, NGO placements, nonprofit placements, association-based placements, all kind of exploded because of this real need in a downturn in actual hiring. There was a need for more student assistance. In the absence of payment, there was a need to come into these educational externship programs. So overall, I think it will benefit our program in the end because new people may be joining in to try to find assistance from students. They want to learn what it takes to be part of our program, what our requirements are, the types of standards that we maintain, and then they come and they meet those standards. So I think there is a bit of a silver lining in all of this.
How are our students faring in the job market? Are there ways to help current students with career connections or job opportunities?
Yeah, the law school still has students that are looking for summer 2020 and graduating students who may not even be able to take the bar until fall of 2020 or even later, depending on the jurisdiction. So I'm certain that my colleagues in the Career Center would appreciate any full or part-time job leads or even opportunities for research projects or work that can be done remotely this summer. And if you're interested in that, a follow-up email will be sent by the alumni office after this webinar with information for the Career Center so you can share your opportunities, whether it be research, job, externship with our students.
If someone can not help with job opportunities now, are there other ways for the GW Law community can assist?
Yeah, sure. So we know that many successful alumni and friends of GW have encountered challenges in their lives. We all have. And you may have some uplifting stories that graduating students may love to hear. So to capture your words and encouragement, the law school's created this initiative. It's called 20 for 20. If you'd like to participate, the alumni office is asking you to complete a Google form where you could share your inspirational message with the GW Law class of 2020. We're asking that you limit your inspirational words to 20 words, hence the name 20 for 20. To financially assist current students, GW Cares Emergency Student Assistance Fund has been established, and that's designed to help students who are facing hardship in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. A group of very generous donors within the law school community have pledged to match all donations up to $100,000 this semester. So, the law school really appreciates any gift of any amount. And so they'll follow up too about this initiative as well. Bottom line is it's a little bit cliche at this point, but we are all in this together. And our hope is that everyone supports one another and those in need within the GW Law community.
Thank you for identifying ways in which the GW Law community can help students. We asked for alumni to submit questions in advance of the webinar, and an alumnus asked the following question. Regarding your fields of anti-corruption and government procurement, what consequences do you foresee from potential U.S. government actions and policies, and how will those relate to your ongoing work?
How it will relate to my ongoing work, I'm going to be busy, very busy for quite some time, not just with the field placement program and all my other duties at the school, but truly where there's chaos, it breeds fraud and corruption. So things are quite busy. And in fact, I'm working with an alum of the law school right now on a white paper that we're going to be releasing soon that describes the many government initiatives designed to combat fraud and corruption associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. Some other examples besides the False Claims Act could be statutes and prosecutions designed to go after fraudulent or illegal schemes, prosecutions going after the sale of fake drugs, prosecutions over anti-competitive things, that's like bid rigging and collusion, other bribery type schemes that may arise out of this. The government is daily announcing new initiatives, task forces, joint partnerships between various agencies to combat corruption and fraud associated with the pandemic. And it's also, routinely touting some of its prosecutions. I've been seeing announcements. I follow the Justice Department on Twitter, and almost daily we're seeing announcements of new prosecutions against individuals that are committing fraud or engaging in collusive behavior. So the government is trying to do this and is active. The problem is that, as I said in a recent interview with that was published by the law school, it's like whack-a-mole. You go after one and then three more schemes pop up in its place. So the government's going to be busy and lawyers are going to be busy for quite some time.
Well, thank you, Dean Tillipman, for sharing your thoughts with us today. I really appreciate your willingness to answer these questions. I wish you the best for the remainder of the semester.
Thank you so much. You too.
Also, I want to thank Mike Briggs from the GW Law IT department. Without his assistance, this webinar would not have been possible. Lastly, I want to thank the GW Law community for joining us this afternoon. We appreciate your time and encourage you to join us for the next webinar. You will receive a follow-up email after this webinar, as Dean Tillipman mentioned. We greatly appreciate your willingness to help our students. GW Law wishes for you and your families to stay safe and well, and know that we are always here for you. Have a lovely rest of your afternoon.